At the Christmas party, they laughed at me for being unemployed. They called me a failure, a charity case, someone who'd wasted her entire life. My own mother stood there sipping champagne, saying nothing while they tore me apart. I wanted to disappear. But then the doors opened, and a man I'd never met walked straight toward me. He said his name was Isaac Redmond. He said we were business partners. My mother's face went white, and when he leaned in close, he whispered 7 words that shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. My name is Marina Blake. I'm 52 years old now, and I live in a modest 2-story house in upstate New York with my mother, Evelyn, who just turned 78 last month. People always ask me why I never left, why I'm still here taking care of her after everything. They don't understand. They weren't there that night at the Christmas party when those women tore me apart with their words, their laughter echoing off the crystal chandeliers like broken glass. They didn't see what happened when my new business partner walked through those doors. But to understand that moment, to really understand why it mattered, you have to go back, way back, to the house on Willow Creek Road where I grew up, where the floorboards creaked like they were trying to tell secrets, and where my mother taught me the only 2 rules that ever mattered in this world: never rely on anyone. That was rule number 1. My mother would say it while she scrubbed dishes with hands that were always red and raw, while she counted pennies at the kitchen table under the flickering light that we could never afford to replace. Never rely on anyone, Marina, because the moment you do, they'll let you go. They'll walk away, they'll disappear. And rule number 2, the one she'd repeat like a prayer every single night before bed, was this: success means survival, not happiness, not love, survival. Those words became the rhythm of my childhood, the pulse that kept me moving forward even when everything else felt like it was falling apart. My father, Thomas Blake, disappeared when I was 9 years old. One Tuesday morning, in October, he kissed my forehead, told me he'd see me after school, and then he was just gone. No note, no explanation, no body. The police came, asked their questions, searched the woods behind our property, dragged the creek, and eventually they stopped coming around. My mother never cried. Not once. She just tightened her jaw, straightened her spine, and kept going like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. My older sister Rachel, she was 14 when Dad vanished, and somehow she became even more perfect afterward. Like she decided to fill the hole he left with achievements and accolades. Princeton at 17, a semester abroad in Paris, then London, then Tokyo. She sent postcards with beautiful stamps and vague messages about how wonderful her life was becoming. She was the golden child, the one my mother would show off to anyone who'd listen. My daughter Rachel, the one at Princeton. My daughter Rachel who speaks 4 languages. My daughter Rachel who's changing the world. And then there was me, Marina, the other daughter, the one who stayed behind in that crooked little house with the peeling paint and the kitchen faucet that never stopped dripping no matter how many times we tried to fix it. I wasn't stupid. I got good grades. I had dreams. But next to Rachel's shine, I was just shadow. My Aunt Greta lived with us on and off during those years. My mother's younger sister, who never quite figured out how to build a life of her own. She'd show up with garbage bags full of clothes and stay in the spare room for months at a time, rummaging through our kitchen cabinets, reorganizing our closets, inserting herself into our routines like she was searching for something she'd lost. I never understood what she was looking for. Not until much later. Not until it was almost too late. My only real friend growing up was Colton Hayes. He lived 3 houses down, in a place that looked even worse than ours, with a father who drank too much and a mother who'd stopped trying to hide the bruises. Colton had this smile, this bright, beautiful smile that he'd flash whenever anyone asked if he was okay. He'd say he fell off his bike or walked into a door, and that smile would make you want to believe him even when you knew better. We'd spend hours in the woods between our houses, building forts out of fallen branches, pretending we were explorers, discovering new worlds where fathers didn't disappear and mothers didn't have to work. 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. Colton understood me in a way Rachel never could. He knew what it felt like to be the kid everyone whispered about, the one people pitied but never actually helped. I always believed the worst pain in my life came from being compared to Rachel, from being the daughter who wasn't quite enough, who couldn't quite measure up. Every parent-teacher conference, every family dinner, every single moment felt like a silent evaluation where I was constantly coming up short. But I didn't know then what I know now. I didn't understand that the real pain, the kind that burrows so deep you can't ever fully dig it out, was something my mother had planted long before I learned how to spell my own name, long before my father vanished, long before any of us understood what we were really living through. Because when I was 11 years old, on a cold November night when the wind rattled our windows and made the whole house feel like it might blow away, I couldn't sleep. I crept downstairs for water, my feet silent on the worn carpet, and I heard voices in the kitchen. My mother and Aunt Greta speaking in whispers that sounded like hissing snakes. I pressed myself against the hallway wall, barely breathing, and that's when I heard my mother say something that made every cell in my body go ice cold. She said, "Greta, you have to stop asking about the deal. What's done is done. We made our choice the night Thomas vanished, and there's no going back now. We saved ourselves, that's all that matters." And my Aunt Greta, her voice trembling, responded with words I'll never forget. "But what about the girls, Evelyn? What about Marina and Rachel? When are you going to tell them the truth?" I stayed frozen in that hallway for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My heart hammered so hard I thought they'd hear it through the walls. The deal. The night Thomas vanished. We saved ourselves. The words kept spinning in my head like a carousel I couldn't stop. I wanted to burst into that kitchen and demand answers. I wanted to scream at my mother, shake her, make her tell me what she'd done. But I was 11 years old, and some part of me understood that once I crossed that threshold, once I asked those questions, nothing would ever be the same again. So I crept back upstairs, climbed into my bed, and pulled the covers over my head like they could protect me from the truth. I didn't sleep at all that night. The weeks that followed were strange. I watched my mother differently, studied her face for cracks in the mask she wore. But Evelyn Blake was a fortress. She went to work at the diner where she waitressed double shifts, came home smelling like grease and coffee, made dinner, checked my homework, and never once let on that anything was wrong. Aunt Greta stayed through. Thanksgiving, tense and quiet, jumping every time the phone rang. I noticed she and my mother stopped talking in rooms where I might overhear. They'd step outside onto the porch, even when it was freezing, their breath making clouds in the air, their voices too low to catch. Something had shifted, something had changed, and I knew it had everything to do with whatever deal they'd made the night my father disappeared. Then came that December night. I remember it so clearly it feels like yesterday. The snow was coming down in thick sheets, piling up against our windows, turning the world outside into nothing but white noise and darkness. I was 12 by then, and I'd gotten better at pretending everything was normal. I'd buried what I'd overheard, tucked it away in some deep corner of my mind where I kept all the things I couldn't process. But that night, something woke me. A sound from above, footsteps in the attic, which was strange because we never used the attic. My mother always said it was full of junk, old boxes, things not worth keeping but too sentimental to throw away. I lay in my bed listening to those footsteps, to the creak of the floorboards overhead, and then I heard voices. Raised voices, my mother and Aunt Greta arguing. I slipped out of bed and moved to the hallway, positioning myself under the attic door that hung open just a crack. Their words filtered down through the narrow staircase, sharp and desperate. My mother's voice cut through first, cold and furious. "If she ever finds out what Thomas agreed to, it'll destroy her," Evelyn snapped. "Do you understand that, Greta? It'll destroy everything we've built, everything we've protected." And Aunt Greta, her voice higher, more frantic, shot back with something that made my skin crawl. "The money won't last forever. Evie, you can't hide the contract forever. Sooner or later, someone's going to come looking. Someone's going to ask questions. What are you going to do then?" There was a long silence. I held my breath, and then my mother said something that changed everything. She said a name. Just one name, spoken like a curse. Redmond. That's all she said. Just Redmond. But the way she said it, with so much venom and fear packed into those two syllables, I knew it meant something. I knew it was important. I repeated it silently to myself, burning it into my memory. Redmond, Redmond. Who was Redmond? What did this person have to do with my father? What was this contract they kept mentioning? The next morning, I woke up expecting answers, expecting confrontation, but when I came downstairs for breakfast, Aunt Greta was gone. Her room was empty. Her bags were gone. The cigarette-burned quilt she always used was folded neatly on the stripped bed, and there was no note, no explanation, no goodbye. I asked my mother where Greta went, and she didn't even look up from her coffee. She said Greta had to leave. She said it was time for Greta to figure out her own life. She said it with such finality that I knew better than to push. But I saw something in my mother's eyes that morning. Relief maybe, or fear, or both. But that wasn't even the strange part. 2 days later, on a gray afternoon when the snow had finally stopped and everything outside looked dead and frozen, my mother did something she'd never done before. She went up to the attic with a toolbox and installed a new deadbolt on the attic door, a heavy, serious lock that required a key. I watched her from the bottom of the stairs, my stomach twisting into knots. When she came down, she looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Hard, almost threatening. She said, "Marina, you are never to go up to that attic. Do you understand me? Never. If I ever catch you up there, you'll lose more than your childhood." I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know how you could lose your childhood. But the way she said it made me nod immediately, made me back away like she'd slapped me. I didn't understand any of this then. I was 12 years old trying to survive middle school, and my mother's impossible expectations and the constant comparisons to Rachel, who was thriving at Princeton, sending home photos of herself at fancy galas and academic conferences. I pushed the attic and the contract and the name Redmond into that same dark corner where I kept all my unanswered questions. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I'd probably misheard everything anyway. But those secrets don't stay buried forever. They have a way of clawing back to the surface, usually at the worst possible moment. Years passed. I graduated high school without any fanfare. I went to community college because that's all we could afford. I worked retail jobs and restaurant jobs and tried to figure out who I was supposed to become when I wasn't Rachel Blake's little sister. By the time I was 24, I was broke, jobless, and living back in that house on Willow Creek Road with my mother. I'd been laid off from my position at a marketing firm. My apartment lease had ended, and I had nowhere else to go. It felt like failure. It felt like proof that my mother had been right all along. Success means survival, and I was barely surviving. One afternoon when my mother was at work, I was going through her bedroom looking for stamps. I needed to mail out resumes, and I knew she kept a stash of office supplies somewhere. That's when I found the jewelry box. It was tucked in the back of her closet, underneath old sweaters that smelled like mothballs. The box was wooden, carved with flowers, and when I opened it, I found the usual things. Cheap earrings, a broken watch, my grandmother's wedding ring, but underneath all of that, folded into a tight square, was a letter. The paper was yellowed, the creases worn soft from being opened and refolded many times. It was addressed to Thomas Blake, my father, and it was from someone named Isaac Redmond. The letter was dated 2 days before my father disappeared. My hands shook as I read it. The words were formal, businesslike, talking about agreements and terms and final payments. But it was the last line that scorched itself into my mind that made my vision blur and my chest tighten until I couldn't breathe. The letter ended with 3 words. Just 3 words, written in sharp, angry handwriting. The child knows. I stared at those 3 words until they blurred together. The child knows. The child knows what? Knows about the deal, knows about the contract, knows what happened to my father. My mind raced through every memory I had of him, searching for some moment, some conversation that would make sense of this. But there was nothing, just the ordinary memories of an ordinary father who read me bedtime stories and taught me how to ride a bike, and then one day walked out the door and never came back. Except now I understood it wasn't ordinary at all. Nothing about my childhood had been ordinary. It had all been constructed, controlled, manipulated by my mother, and whatever agreement she'd made with this Isaac Redmond person. I put the letter back exactly where I'd found it, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped the jewelry box. I didn't confront my mother. Not then. I was 24 years old, unemployed, living under her roof, eating her food, and I had no power, no leverage. So I did what I'd always done. I swallowed the truth and kept moving forward. But something had changed inside me. That letter had lit a fire and I couldn't put it out, no matter how hard I tried. I started applying to jobs obsessively, sometimes 10 or 15 applications a day. I needed to get out of that house. I needed to build a life that was mine, not one my mother had designed for me. I needed to understand what role I was supposed to play in whatever twisted arrangement she'd made. But here's the thing about being 24 and broke and desperate. You start to notice patterns. I'd get calls for interviews, promising conversations with hiring managers who seemed genuinely interested. They'd say things like, "Your resume is impressive, Marina. We'd love to have you come in." And I'd get excited. I'd prepare. I'd show up early in my one good interview suit. And then something would happen. The position would suddenly be filled. The company would be restructuring. The manager would look at me with this strange mixture of pity and discomfort and say, "I'm sorry, but we've decided to go in a different direction." It happened over and over again. 12 interviews in 3 months, and 12 rejections. I started to feel like I was cursed, like there was something fundamentally wrong with me that everyone could see except me. My mother's reaction to all of this should have been my first real clue. When I'd come home dejected after another failed interview, she wouldn't comfort me. She wouldn't tell me to keep trying or that the right opportunity would come along. Instead, she'd say things like, "Maybe it's a sign, Marina. Maybe you're meant to stay here." Or, "There are worse things than being close to family." And once, after I'd been particularly upset about losing out on a position I'd really wanted, she looked at me with this cold satisfaction and said, "Perfect. Now you can't leave town." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I'm sorry you're going through this." Just this bizarre relief that I was still trapped in her orbit. My sister Rachel called every few weeks from whatever exotic location she was currently gracing with her presence. She'd been living in Singapore for a year, working for some international consulting firm, and her life sounded like something out of a magazine. When I told her about the interview situation, about how nothing seemed to be working out, she laughed. Not cruelly, but dismissively. She said, "Marina, you're being paranoid. Not everything is a conspiracy. Maybe you're just not interviewing well. Maybe you need to work on your presentation." It was so typical of Rachel to assume the problem was me, that I was somehow failing at something she'd found effortless. She'd never struggled a day in her life. Everything had always fallen perfectly into place for her. And she couldn't comprehend that maybe, just maybe, someone was actively working against me. But Colton understood. Colton Hayes, my childhood friend who'd escaped his abusive home and built a decent life as a contractor. He was the only person who believed me. We'd stayed in touch over the years, meeting for coffee whenever he was working jobs in the area. One afternoon, after I'd told him about yet another mysteriously canceled interview, he got this look on his face, uncomfortable, like he was debating whether to tell me. Something he'd been holding back for a long time. Finally, he leaned across the table and said it. "Marina, your mother talks to people before you even know their names. She's been doing it since we were kids. My mom told me once that your mother called the high school counselor before your college applications went out. Told him you weren't ready to leave home, that you needed to stay close for family reasons." I didn't want to believe it, but now, hearing about all these interviews falling through, I think she's doing it again. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too hot. I couldn't breathe. Colton kept talking, his voice gentle but firm, telling me about other times he'd heard rumors. Other moments when my mother had inserted herself into situations that should have been mine alone. The summer internship I didn't get. The scholarship that went to someone else despite my higher scores. Little interventions over the years that I'd chalked up to bad luck or poor timing. But it wasn't luck. It was sabotage. It was my own mother systematically destroying my chances at independence because of some reason I didn't understand. Some clause in a contract I'd never seen. Some deal she'd made with a man named Isaac Redmond. The only person who really supported me during this time was Jenna Clark. We'd worked together at the marketing firm before we both got laid off, and we'd decided to become roommates to save money. Jenna was one of those relentlessly optimistic people who believed everything happened for a reason and that the universe had a plan. She'd make us dinner and pour cheap wine and insist that my breakthrough was coming. She'd say, "One day, Marina, you're going to uncover why your mother is terrified of you succeeding. And when you do, it's going to blow your mind." I laughed when she said it. I thought she was being dramatic, trying to make me feel better by turning my life into some kind of mystery novel. I shouldn't have laughed. I should have listened, because one night, about 2 months after I'd moved in with Jenna, I came back to my mother's house to pick up some boxes I'd left in the garage. It was late, maybe 10 o'clock, and I'd assumed my mother would be asleep. But when I pulled up, I saw lights on in the attic. The attic that had been locked for over a decade. The attic I'd been forbidden from entering on pain of losing more than my childhood. I sat in my car for a long moment, watching that light, my heart pounding. Then I got out. I went inside as quietly as I could. I crept up the stairs past my old bedroom to the attic door, and it was open, just slightly ajar. I could hear sounds from inside. The rustle of paper, my mother's breathing heavy and labored. I pushed the door open wider and looked inside. My mother was surrounded by boxers and old filing cabinets, and in her hands was a paper shredder. She was feeding documents into it one after another, her face drawn and pale in the harsh overhead light. Scraps of paper littered the floor around her feet. I must have made some sound because she whipped around, her eyes wide with panic. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then I looked down at the shredded papers on the floor. Most were destroyed beyond recognition, but one piece, larger than the others, had fallen near my foot. I bent down and picked it up. The heading was still visible. Isaac Redmond Foundation, it read. Project Ledger. My mother lunged for it, but I stepped back, my eyes scanning the fragment frantically. There were names listed, dates, monetary amounts, and there, in the middle section, partially torn but still legible, was a sentence that made my blood run cold. Subject MB to be monitored until activation. MB Marina Blake. I looked up at my mother, and in her face, I saw everything. Guilt, fear, and something else. Something that looked almost like resignation. Like she'd known this moment was coming and had been dreading it for years. I stood there holding that piece of paper, my whole body shaking. Subject MB to be monitored until activation. The words didn't make sense, and yet they made perfect sense. Every canceled interview, every mysteriously lost opportunity, every time my mother had smiled with relief when I failed, it wasn't love, it wasn't protection, it was surveillance. I was being watched, tracked, kept in place like some kind of laboratory specimen, waiting for the right conditions to be studied. My mother grabbed for the paper again, but I shoved it in my pocket and backed toward the door. She didn't say anything. She just stood there among the shredded documents, her face crumbling, and I realized she'd been shredding evidence. She'd known something was coming. She'd been preparing. I left that night without another word. I went back to Jenna's apartment and I didn't sleep. I sat on my bed with that fragment of paper and I Googled Isaac Redmond Foundation until my eyes burned. There wasn't much. A few mentions in academic journals from the 80s and 90s, something about behavioral research and genetic studies. A building that had been shut down in upstate New York, not far from where we lived, but nothing concrete. Nothing that explained what my father had been involved in or why I was apparently a subject in some ongoing project. I felt like I was going insane. Like I'd stumbled into someone else's life. Some thriller movie that couldn't possibly be real. But that paper in my pocket was real. My mother's face was real. The years of sabotage were real. The months that followed were strange. I stopped telling my mother where I was applying for jobs. I started using Jenna's address on applications instead of my mother's house. And slowly, carefully, things started to change. I got callbacks. I got second interviews. I finally landed a position at a small consulting firm. Nothing glamorous, but it was mine. I'd done it without my mother's interference, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe. But there was this nagging feeling I couldn't shake. This sense that I was waiting for something. That the other shoe hadn't dropped yet. That whoever had written subject MB to be monitored until activation was still out there, still watching, still waiting for whatever activation meant. Then came last year, December. The annual Willow Creek Holiday Gala. This overblown Christmas party that the town threw every year at the country club. I hadn't wanted to go. I'd been avoiding my mother as much as possible, keeping our interactions brief and surface level. But she called me 3 days before the event and insisted. She said it was important. She said it was good for appearances. That people were asking about me, that I needed to show my face and prove I was doing well. There was something in her voice, something desperate and pleading. That made me agree. I should have trusted my instincts. I should have stayed away. The moment I walked into that party, I knew it was a mistake. The room was full of people I'd grown up with. People who'd watched me fail over and over again. Who'd whispered about me at church and in grocery store aisles. They looked at me like I was the town charity case. Like I was something to be pitied and discussed in hushed tones over cheese platters and mulled wine. I tried to smile. I tried to act like I belonged there. But within 15 minutes, the comments started. Elaine Donovan, my mother's church friend, who wore too much perfume and had opinions about everything, came up to me with this saccharine smile and said loudly enough for half the room to hear, "Well, look who it is, Miss Midlife Crisis. Marina, darling, are you still looking for work or have you given up entirely?" I felt my face burn. I mumbled something about having a job now, about things going well. But Elaine had already moved on, floating away to spread her poison somewhere else. Pastor Neil, the man who'd baptized me when I was 6 months old, who'd known me my entire life, walked past and muttered just loud enough for me to hear. Shame she never found her calling. Such potential wasted. And then there was my cousin Derek, already 3 wines deep and swaying slightly, who laughed so loudly the whole room turned to look. He said, "Don't worry, Marina. Maybe Santa will bring you a job this year, or at least some ambition." People laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to make me want to sink through the floor and disappear forever. I looked for my mother, expecting her to say something, to defend me, to tell these people to shut their mouths. But she was standing by the bar with her champagne, talking to some woman I didn't recognize, and when our eyes met, she just shrugged slightly, like this was my fault. Like I'd brought this humiliation on myself. Then she said, loud enough for the people around her to hear, "Well, she could have done better with guidance. I tried my best, but some children just don't listen." I felt something break inside me. Not just my heart, something deeper. The last fragile thread that connected me to the woman who'd raised me snapped completely. I turned toward the exit, ready to leave, ready to walk out of that party and never look back. But then the doors opened. The big double doors at the entrance to the ballroom, the ones that led in from the main hallway, and a man walked in. He was tall, probably in his late 50s, wearing a dark wool coat that looked expensive. His hair was silver at the temples and his eyes scanned the room with this intense focus. Like he was looking for something specific. Like he already knew everyone in the room and was searching for one particular face. The conversations around me died down. People turned to look. Nobody recognized him. He wasn't from Willow Creek. I watched my mother across the room, and her face did something I'd never seen before. All the color drained out of it. Her champagne glass tilted dangerously in her hand, the liquid sloshing against the rim. She looked terrified. The man walked straight toward me. Not toward the hosts. Not toward the bar. Directly toward me, weaving through clusters of people who parted automatically like he carried some kind of authority they couldn't question. My heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. He stopped right in front of me, so close I could smell his cologne. Something woody and expensive. He looked at me with these piercing gray eyes, and there was something in his expression I couldn't read. Recognition, maybe? Or satisfaction, he said. Marina Blake. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I was confused, terrified, completely lost. He extended his hand and I took it automatically, my palms sweating against his. His grip was firm, confident. He said, "My name is Isaac Redmond, your new business partner." The room fell completely silent. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every eye turned toward us. I heard someone's glass hit the floor and shatter, but nobody moved to clean it up. I looked at my mother, and her face had turned the color of bleached paper, white and bloodless. Her lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. Isaac Redmond. The name from the letter, the name my mother and Aunt Greta had whispered about in the attic, the name on the foundation that had been monitoring me. He was here. He was real. And he'd just announced to everyone in this room that we were business partners, which made no sense because I'd never met this man in my life. Isaac leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only I could hear. What he said next made my heart stop completely, made the room spin, made everything I thought I knew about my life tilt sideways. He said, "Your father didn't disappear, Marina. He was taken, and you're next if we don't move fast." I don't remember deciding to leave. I don't remember excusing myself or pushing through the crowd, but suddenly I was outside in the cold December air, my breath coming in short panicked gasps, and Isaac Redmond was beside me. I spun on him, fury and terror mixing into something I couldn't control. I demanded answers. I demanded to know who he was and what he wanted and what the hell he meant about my father being taken. And he told me. Right there in the parking lot with Christmas lights twinkling on the building behind us and the sound of the party muffled through the walls, Isaac Redmond told me everything, and none of it made sense. Yet all of it felt horribly, sickeningly familiar. He said that 30 years ago. My father had been involved with the Redmond Foundation, a private research group that studied something they called genetic predisposition for influence. He said they were looking at families, at bloodlines, at people who had unusual abilities to persuade, to lead, to change minds and shape outcomes. My father had been recruited because he'd shown signs of this ability. He could walk into a room and make people listen. He could negotiate impossible deals. He could convince anyone of anything if he set his mind to it. The foundation wanted to study him to understand the mechanisms behind his gift, and they'd offered him money, resources, opportunities. But there was a contract. There was always a contract, and part of that contract gave them access to his children, to study whether these abilities were hereditary. According to Isaac, my father wasn't mentally ill. He wasn't unstable or troubled or any of the things I'd half wondered about over the years. He was recruited, he was valuable. And when I was born, when they ran their initial tests and saw that I'd inherited something from him, some spark or potential they found interesting, the foundation doubled down. They wanted long-term access. They wanted to monitor my development, track my progress, study how these abilities manifested in a second generation. My father had agreed at first, Isaac said. He'd thought it was harmless. Just some assessments, some interviews, nothing invasive. But as I got older, as the foundation's interest in me intensified, he'd started to understand what he'd really signed up for. He'd tried to break the deal. He'd threatened to go public, to expose what they were doing, and that's when he vanished. My mother, Isaac explained, had received money to keep me contained. That was the word he used. Contained, to keep me visible and predictable and controlled. To make sure I never became independent enough to disappear, never successful enough to move somewhere the foundation couldn't reach me. Every job I didn't get, every opportunity that fell through, it wasn't bad luck. It was my mother following the terms of the contract she'd signed after my father disappeared. She'd been paid to sabotage me, to keep me trapped, to make sure that when the foundation decided to restart their research, I'd be right where they could find me. And the reason Isaac had shown up now, the reason he'd walked into that Christmas party and announced himself as my business partner, was because the foundation had restarted Project Ledger. They were targeting second-generation subjects now. People like me, the children of their original research participants. He said, "You weren't meant to be jobless, Marina. You were meant to be dependent, accessible, trackable. Your mother thought she was protecting you, but she was just keeping you in place for them." I felt sick. Actually physically ill. I bent over with my hands on my knees, trying not to vomit right there in the parking lot. Everything made sense now. Every piece of my broken life suddenly fit into this horrible, twisted puzzle. I went back to my mother's house that night. I didn't tell Isaac where I was going. I just got in my car and drove there on autopilot, rage and betrayal burning in my chest. She was already home, sitting at the kitchen table with all the lights off, staring at nothing. When I walked in, she didn't even look up. I stood in the doorway and I asked her if it was true. I asked her if she'd been sabotaging me my entire life. I asked her if my father was really gone or if he was out there somewhere, trapped or hidden or worse. And she broke instantly. Completely. She started crying these horrible, gasping sobs. And she said, "I did it to keep you alive, Marina. They wanted you for your mind. For what you inherited from your father. You think joblessness was your failure? It was my only protection. If you'd succeeded, if you'd become visible, they would have taken you just like they took him." I didn't stay to hear more. I couldn't. I ran upstairs, packed everything I could fit into 2 suitcases, and I left. I left that house on Willow Creek Road forever. I blocked my mother's number. I moved in with Jenna temporarily while I figured out what to do next. Isaac had given me his card, told me to call him when I was ready to hear the rest, but I wasn't ready. I didn't know if I'd ever be ready. I just wanted to breathe, to exist without feeling like I was being watched or controlled or shaped into something I never agreed to be. 2 weeks passed. I started to feel almost normal. I went to work. I made dinner with Jenna. I tried to pretend my life hadn't imploded. And then a package arrived at my new apartment. No return address. Just my name written in careful block letters on the brown paper wrapping. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a photograph, old and faded, of my father holding me as a baby. I was maybe 6 months old, wrapped in a pink blanket, and he was looking down at me with this expression of pure love and terror mixed together. Like he knew what was coming. Like he was trying to memorize my face before something took him away. Underneath the photo was a flash drive, small and black, with a label in neat handwriting. Ledger Dash continued, and at the bottom of the box was a note. Just a few lines on white paper, written in the same handwriting that had been on the flash drive. Isaac Redmond's handwriting? It said, "They found your mother. They're coming for you next."